And as part of our Supplier Spotlight series, you're here with Tom from Maritrace. How are you doing, Tom?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Very good. So, to kick off, great to get an understanding of kind of who you are and what Maritrace do.
Thank you very much. Well, my name's Tom Owen. I am CEO and co-founder of Maritrace. We're effectively a vessel tracking company. We started off in the maritime world about 2008, looking at security incidents and assessing the risk to vessels from piracy, which principally at the time was happening around the Gulf of Aden area. And from there, it was a very natural path for us to start to moving into looking at the positions of vessels and how those related to the security incidents that were going on in the world, and doing live risk assessments for vessels. And then we started to look at the tracking of vessels in very much more detail, because we realized that this would give us a lot of information about what vessels were doing from an economic perspective. So we have moved, although we still have a very, very big foothold in the maritime security world, we started to move quite ergonomically into looking at using maritime data to make measurements about the economic impact of shipping.
Focusing on that economic impact then, what is the challenge that you are trying to solve?
Well, when we first started looking at vessel tracking data, we realized that it was very good for saying this is where a vessel is right now, and looking at lines on a map to say this is where a vessel has been historically, and showing pretty colored lines on an interface. But we realized very quickly that this could start to solve the problem of knowing what vessels were up to from this economic perspective. And so to that end, what we decided to do, the challenge that we set ourselves, was to look at each vessel individually and try and work out not just where was it moving and not just which ports was it calling at, but what was it doing when it was in those ports. And the main question there is, was it loading something? And if so, how much stuff was it loading? Or was it discharging its cargo, and how much of that cargo was it discharging? So we started to build a huge database of vessel movement from port A to port B, and saying it was carrying X tons of stuff from A to B. But we wanted to go a step further than that and try and solve the worldwide problem, saying what commodity is on each of those vessels. And we now do this in real time. I think we've got about 7,500 ports, in excess of, in fact, on our database. And we monitor those ports, and we look at which vessels are stopping at those ports. Are they loading? Are they discharging? Who owns those vessels? Who controls those vessels? In many cases, which berths are they going to? What are they picking up? And where are they discharging it? And because of the way we gather the data, we can effectively do this in real time. So I could tell you, for example, today, how much iron ore has left Port Hedland in the last hour, rather than some of the more traditional methods, which is waiting for these ports to self-report to say, today, this vessel loaded 100,000 tons of iron ore and took it somewhere. We don't know where it's going. That's not our business. Well, here at Maritrace, we know that it's been picked up. We're monitoring this in real time, and we're following those vessels as they move across the sea. And it means that we're building a global database of world trade effectively in real time.
Who are the kind of people that you're targeting with this? Like, who does this help?
That's a very big question, because this kind of data can help a lot of people, regardless of whether or not they think they are involved in the maritime world. I mean, there is the obvious maritime segment. If you are a bulk carrier company and you want to look at what rival bulk carrier companies are doing, then it's a great tool for seeing how well they may or may not be doing with their cargoes. It's also a very effective way of tracking what you are doing in real time. But even if you're not involved in maritime or shipbroking or anything like that, it's very helpful information, because I think the rule of thumb is 90% of world's trade moves via the sea. And so if you've got any interest in world trade and how stuff is being moved around the world, then our data could help you. I mean, I mentioned the iron ore there, and there are various other commodities which we can look at, LNG, coal, grain, all of these really cool things. But I mean, let's look at a very specific example. For example, you might say that you deal in bauxite, for example. If you're dealing in bauxite, then it is very, very helpful to know where there are dips in trade, which countries are now exporting more, which countries are importing more. Are there opportunities for your market there? So what we do tend to find is most of the people who are interested in our data tend to be very much financial services companies who require our data to feed into their systems as a small part or as a much larger part to feed into their systems to give them that macroeconomic view on world trade.
So how is it that you create these data sets? How do you track those commodities?
Well, it all starts with the vessel, obviously, and where she is, where each vessel in the world is. And we tap into a network of AIS data, which is basically messages sent by vessels, which most of them are legally obliged to send, which is actually an anti-collision system at its core. It is to send out signals to say, here I am, please don't crash into me, to other vessels in the area. But it has this wonderful byproduct, which means if we tap into that, we have the position of every vessel around the world pretty much in real time. And as I mentioned, we have this database of around 7,500 ports around the world. So we can say, well, we know this vessel has gone into this port. And then we can look at how deep in the water or not a vessel may be. And from that, we can use some cunning mathematics to try and calculate how much she has loaded or discharged at a given port in terms of the number of tons. And that's how we know how much stuff is moving around. The next part of the equation is, well, how do we figure out what that stuff is? And in some cases, it's fairly straightforward. Let's look at an LNG vessel. We know all of the LNG vessels in the world, and we know if an LNG carrier goes to a port and loads something, chances are it's going to have been LNG that she's loaded there. And then if she goes and discharges, then we know that that commodity must have been LNG that she's discharged at the next port. But there are a number of sort of more generic vessels, shall we say. A bulk carrier would be a very good example. Bulk carriers can carry lots of different things. You just chuck it in the hold, don't even bag it up, just pop it in the hold, pour it in, and it can literally be anything. So the question is, how do we know what these commodities are? So what we've done is for hundreds of these ports around the world, we've gone in, we've looked at the individual berths that they stop at. And we've done a lot of research to try and determine what commodity each berth deals with. So a very good example would be Port Hedland in Australia has a number of berths, most of which deal with one commodity and one commodity only. And that happens to be iron ore. So we can tell when a vessel goes to one of these berths and she's loaded 200,000 tons of stuff, we can have a look at that berth and say, well, this berth only deals with iron ore. So we know that commodity must have been iron ore that she picked up and discharged elsewhere. But it can also work in reverse. If we know that a vessel has loaded at a berth that we don't know about, but she has gone and discharged at a berth that only deals with grain, then we can say, right, that record for that vessel, we weren't sure what the commodity was, and we're quite open when we're not 100% sure, but we now know she's arrived here, she's arrived at this berth that only deals with grain, and therefore that commodity on that bulk carrier must have been grain. Ergo, 150,000 tons of grain has just been discharged at this port, and it was collected over at this port over here. So we basically have this real-time database, which starts a record as soon as a vessel leaves the port and says, was it loaded? Was it empty? What was on it? And then follows that vessel, and then we follow it all the way to the end port, and we say, right, we know what was going on that transit. And we make this data available not as soon as the transit is closed, but the moment the vessel leaves the start port, we will say, okay, we've picked up a new transit. We've picked up a new cargo leaving a port. We're not 100% sure where it's going yet, but let's follow it. And then we will continually update that record until we can say, okay, we know that she carried 175,000 tons of coal from this port to this port. She traveled X miles, so she was doing X ton miles. So we know that this port over here is up on its grain imports 15% on what they were doing last month, for example. And as I mentioned, this is effectively in real time. We are not waiting for these ports to self-report, because very few of them do self-report. We're not waiting for larger data sets like the UN Comtrade database to update, which only happens, every few years sometimes. This is basically happening as the vessels are moving throughout the world.
Thanks, Tom. So what does that result in for your customers?
Well, for our customers, it effectively means that they have a live database of world trade, of vessels moving all over the world, and who own those vessels. So right now we can say, how well are Maersk doing today compared to yesterday? How well are they doing in the last hour compared with the previous hour? We can go right down to that granularity. So this means our customers take all of that data. Some of them take it via our interface. We've got a beautiful Tableau interface, which we've designed to present this data. Most of them will take the raw data and they will ingest that, usually on a nightly basis, but we can do it more often if they want. They'll ingest that data into their systems, and then they can start to use that to inform the decisions they make or the advice that they give to their clients. Now, on that note, one thing we are very careful about in Maritrace is we don't give advice about what's happening. We say, this is what we are observing from the raw data as to what's going on around the world on the seas with these vessels. We don't say, and to you, this will mean this. Because that's not our ballpark. That's not our expertise. Our expertise is providing that data and providing it to the customers so they use their expertise, their niche knowledge to benefit from that data, either directly to themselves or for any customers that they have.
Really interesting, Tom. So finally, what's next for Maritrace? What are the plans?
Well, our development list is huge. It's always huge. We don't stand still. We don't say this is the product and that's it, and that's all it's going to be for all time. There are many improvements that we're doing to our interface, which is where you can actually come right back to the beginning, look at these dots on a map and on live and real time and see what that means to you. And there are many data feeds that we're adding to that. But from the commodities perspective, what we're really looking very closely at is figuring out where those vessels are going before they get there. And that's actually a very, very difficult question to answer because, if you have a vessel that leaves LA or Long Beach, for example, how on earth are you going to know where that vessel goes to? Now, to solve that, what we've done is we've been employing machine learning expertise. And this team is looking at the past history of vessels and saying, does this vessel actually have a very predictable pattern? And if she does have a predictable pattern, where is she going to be going next in her schedule? Or if she doesn't have a predictable pattern, we have to start to say, okay, that we can't look at the vessel and figure out what she's doing based on what she's done in the past. But let's look at the berth that she's called at. Let's see who might be controlling that vessel at the time. Let's see, has that vessel changed ownership lately? Well, she has changed ownership lately to a company that traditionally serves this port. So maybe the commodity she's picked up there is going there. So it's trying to not just say this is what's happening now, but to each transit that's live, when a vessel is left, we've got a live transit, where do we think that transit is going to go to? So we might therefore be able to predict how much iron ore is going to be ending up in China, not how much has arrived today, but how much is going to arrive in the next week. How much grain do we think Ukraine might be exporting in the next couple of weeks, that kind of thing. And so it's more about improving what we have in terms of predictability and improving what we have where, as I mentioned, we don't know in every case what those commodities may be on a vessel. But there are methods that we can utilize to improve that process, to say, again, we don't know, because there's nothing specific about that berth which nails down that commodity. There's nothing specific about that vessel which nails down that commodity. But we should be able to use additional research to say, oh, okay, previously that berth dealt with a lot of different commodities. Now it seems to be focusing in on one particular commodity, so we can start to say with a bit more confidence, this live vessel, previously we weren't sure what that commodity might be. Now we have a much, much better idea of what that commodity is. So it's generally, from the commodities database, it's very much improving the accuracy and it's improving the predictability of the algorithm. From the interface, from looking at the dots on the map, there are so many other bits that we're working on to assist our users in making Maritrace much more of an analytical tool rather than simply saying, hey, here's a pretty map with some colorful dots on it. It's about taking that data and allowing the user to, in real time, query that data to say, what does that mean? What will be happening? What has been happening? Not just, here are some lovely colorful dots I'm looking at.
Excellent. Well, that sounds really exciting, and obviously the use of machine learning within these data sets is becoming more and more important. So really excited to hear that you're heading in that direction. But thank you very much, Tom. Really, really interesting.
No problem. Thank you, James.
Cheers.